So tonight is going to be just like our previous nights. The second half of the semester, we're going to go over IFS and the chapter on that, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll do some experiential activities with music therapy. So hopefully that'll be fun and relaxing. So they didn't call this chapter, IFS, but um, that's pretty much what this whole chapter is about. So IFS, is internal family systems therapy. And I think that IFS does have a lot of original thought to it because it's all about the internal components of our personality and the way we compartmentalize them in our minds. But I think a lot of it's also drawn from other areas of psychology. Nothing's totally original. So, they call this internal family systems. A lot is drawn from external family systems theory. And there's a lot of theorists like Bowen and Satir and, people like that. But also, I think it goes back further than that, because if you study certain philosophies or religions like Zen Buddhism, so a lot of the key concepts in this really echo some of the philosophical ideas behind Zen Buddhism. So, for instance, we are not our ego. We're really what we call the observer. And we can be an active observer. We are not our emotions, but we can observe our emotions and consider them and decide basically how we would like to not only experience those emotions, but whether we want to hold on to them or let them pass through us, which is detachment, or whether they are rational or irrational. But it also allows us to respond appropriately or react to what those emotions are resulting from. So, I think there's a lot of original thought to this. I also think there's, it's based on a lot of other things too. I like the quote from Rumi in the beginning. This being humans, a guest house, every morning's a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Treat each guest honorably. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So if you think about it, if you are inviting these guests, which are your emotions and experiences in, and it's really a different way of describing the observer. So it's kind of an interesting dialogue that we can have in our own minds. So the first client that is discussed, Mary, with dissociative identity disorder. So here's the thing. He started off with an example of DID, dissociative identity disorder. And I can understand why, but all of the rest of the chapter where he's applying IFS is technically not dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder like it used to be called. So the difference being the word dissociative. Oftentimes, if somebody truly has dissociative identity disorder, they are not aware of all of the other identities. So the other thing is that I've had a lot of students, like when I used to teach DSM, and I say, well, let's pick a disorder that you'd like to work with. And everybody's interested in multiple personalities or dissociative identity disorder because they've seen it in movies, they've read it in books. It's like, it's an interesting disorder, but I can't tell you how incredibly rare it actually is. And so many people are diagnosed with it that actually do not have it. So if people think it's common, it's extremely rare. I have never had a client with DID. I've been doing this for, I don't know, since 1992. So I mean, extremely rare. So friend of mine, George Williams, he worked with Corey in California, and then he worked with me at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And his specialty when he was a therapist was multiple personality disorder. And so if that's your specialty, people will be sent to you from all over the country. There's not a lot of specialists with that disorder because it's so hard to find clients and it's so hard to deal with them. It takes an extended period of time and treatment. And so I think that so the stories he would share with me were really interesting. But I'll just share a funny one with you. Not that the disorder is funny, but so George is also very strong in Christian beliefs, and he comes from a fundamental background. And the thing with true multiple personalities is some of the personalities are a bit extreme. And one time he got a client, and one of the hidden personalities that came out after multiple sessions was a demonic personality. And we know that this was just a self-protection for that person. And, you know, however, it scared him so badly, he stopped treating multiple personalities. So yeah, it's very interesting. Even the example in the book is fairly interesting because various aspects of the personality that come out are often very diverse. So you'll have extremes of personalities. They won't be really closely related. But I do want to say that it's interesting that they started off with DID because it's really the extreme, you know. So all of the other clients where they're talking about applying IFS, they're not dissociative DID, they're not multiple personalities. Every single one of us has what we call subpersonalities within our mind that makes up who we are as a total person. And we can see that in everyday life. Sometimes we're happy and carefree, and sometimes we experience some type of struggle or an argument, or maybe they charge us too much for repairing our car, and then we get angry or controlling, or we have some response to that sense of unfairness or being mistreated or cheated. We have our own personalities with different types of relationships, whether it be significant others or different kinds of friends, or at work, or whatever our role is in work. So we can see it in our own lives. And I think one of the healthiest things that we can do is be aware of those different parts of our personality. And if we're aware of it, then we can kind of observe our emotional reaction. It might be, if we're feeling helpless, it might be more controlling. If we're feeling cheated, betrayed, treated unfairly, we might respond with anger, but there's usually an underlying emotion to that anger, which is really a secondary emotion. So we can ask ourselves, hey, what's beneath that anger? Do we feel betrayed or cheated, or what's beneath that? And then we can address the real issue at hand a little more reasonably. So if we begin to ask ourselves, if after we observe the emotion, oh, what's that about? How is that part of our personality protecting us? Or what is the other purpose it serves? So if we haven't experienced trauma, each part of our personality serves some purpose, even if it is altruistic. So maybe the purpose is serving others, because we feel that that is a meaningful and fulfilling thing to do. So the purpose for us would be finding meaning and fulfillment in our lives by helping others. So there's always some purpose. And sometimes they're not rational. Sometimes they are irrational. Sometimes we overreact. So I can tell you a personal example. I use the example of, going to a garage or a car dealer and something's wrong with the car. I had just graduated with my master's degree in counseling. And, as you go through this 2-year degree, students, including myself, we can't help but apply what we're learning to ourselves. So I was constantly kind of applying what I learned to myself. So I had gotten a nice job after I graduated, and my car, had a student's car and it had died, so I had to buy a new car. So I bought a new car, and the CD player wouldn't work. So I brought it back and they replaced it, and they replaced it like 3 times. And finally I came back and I'm like, why can't you replace it with one that works? And they told me that basically they're replacing it with refurbished ones that were supposedly fixed. And they were tired of replacing it, so I'd have to talk to Nissan about my warranty. And my immediate reaction was anger. And then I'm like, oh, all right, what's beneath my anger? And I felt like I was being treated unfairly because I had bought my first new car. And, I felt like I was being cheated in some way. But then I'm like, okay, so anger never works. It just makes them defensive. What should I do as a therapist with these people at the car dealer? And I said, well, I have to create empathy in them. I have to help them to have empathy for me. So I had it like an impromptu counseling session, and I told them about how I never had a new car before, and my last one died just as I was graduating, and I could barely afford the payments. And I asked them if they'd ever been in that situation. And of course, everybody has a first time for buying a car. And I said, boy, just imagine, you buy your first new car, and and you're driving down the road and you pop in that CD and you want to listen to some of your favorite music in your brand new car, and it just doesn't work. It just keeps skipping. And you have to keep taking it back and it just doesn't work. And they didn't even let me finish. They're like, all right, we'll get you a new CD player. So only use these counseling skills for good, though. So the interesting thing is, through example, they walk you through the process of IFS, and and I think it's really a nice procedure for people who've experienced trauma, but I also think it works for everybody who's experienced some type of family dysfunction. I don't think it has to be, I mean, I don't want to minimize trauma, but there are different levels of trauma. Um, and maybe we grew up in you know, an alcoholic family, or a codependent family, or some kind of dysfunction. I think, thinking about IFS and any type of dysfunctional family upbringing, I think it would help anybody who grew up in that situation, not just people who experienced more severe trauma. So the first thing it talks about is really separating the individual from the disorder. Knowing how much energy the sheer act of survival requires keeps me from being surprised at the price they often pay, the absence of a loving relationship with their own bodies, minds, and souls. And I think the example they provide of a soldier who sees their friend killed in a war and comes back, and they're with a significant other, and the significant other um, wants to display some intimacy, and but the reaction unconsciously is that the person who was in the service and deployed, came back, finds something wrong and begins an argument. Well, when an argument begins, then intimacy stops. So it was an unconscious way of protecting this individual from the intimacy their significant other was initiating. They had to become aware of this defensive, I don't want to call it a mechanism, because IFS would call it a part of our personality that was defending us from whatever we felt threatened by. So it's a very simple thing. Rather than saying, I am angry, or I was angry with my significant other, we would rephrase that and say, a part of me was angry. So if we see it as all of us being all of me being angry, I'm really not separating myself from that emotion or from the disorder or from the trauma, and it's all combined. And so they would call this blended. And so by changing our language, it also reminds us that this is just one part of me. This is just one part of my personality reacting that way. And so then the next question would be, okay, so let's name that part of your personality. And they have very specific names that we'll go talk about, like the manager, the firefighter, you know, and but we can name them whatever we want, if we feel like a certain name is more appropriate. So that's the angry part, whatever it is. So what was that? What was the angry part of you? What was the purpose? Why did they come? Why did that part come forward? What were they protecting you from? So, once they become aware of the reason that part of the personality came forward, and that it might not have been at an appropriate time or an appropriate reaction, might have been at an irrational reaction because they were in fight or flight mode and they needed to protect themselves. And they knew that anger would stop any type of intimacy. So with that awareness, we become the observer of all those parts of our personality. And we begin to separate each part and its purpose and how it reacts, and whether it reacts rationally or irrationally as a result of residual trauma. So he writes that a central task for recovery from trauma is to learn to live with the memories of the past without being overwhelmed with them in the present. Just as we need to revisit traumatic memories in order to integrate them, we need to revisit the parts of ourselves that develop the defense habits that help us to survive. So as we look at the different parts of our personality, whether it's the angry part or the manager or the firefighter, we realize, okay, this is why they surface. This is why we are using this part of our personality at this moment, and this is what we're fearing. And then the next question is basically, how did those originate? What was their original purpose? What were they originally protecting us from? And that allows us to examine the traumatic experience from the past from basically an observer's standpoint. So we're no longer re-experiencing the trauma because we're observing that part of our personality and how it originated. So, I think probably the most difficult part of the personality, and it's probably the last part to address, is what they call the exile. And that's basically the part of the personality that was shut down because of the trauma. And all of these other parts of the personality rose up to or were created to protect that. And if the trauma occurred as a child, it is probably the innocent, fun-loving part of childhood that was basically repressed or shut down. And of course, it's still shut down as an adult, So it never ended. So when we think about this, what happens when the self is no longer in charge? When what I call the observer or the self, IFS calls this blending, when we're not aware of why we're reacting in certain ways. And it ends up hurting relationships or hurting ourselves. So if it's hurting a relationship, we might be critical or sometimes people have affairs, like one of the examples in the book, or people get angry, or think of anything that could hurt a relationship, and then think of parts of the personality that might be created that end up hurting ourselves, whether it's drinking or um, acting in certain ways, anything from cutting to, um, putting ourselves in dangerous positions. So when we think about the steps um, of addressing these parts of our personality, if an individual has experienced trauma, uh, the first step is that clients are asked to identify the part involved in the current problem. Like maybe it's a part of the personality that says, I feel worthless or abandoned or obsessed with vengeful thoughts. And, you know, uh, what what is it that that is causing that? What part of your personality? How would we identify that part of the personality? Next, the therapist asks, how do you feel towards that part of you? So it's no longer all of us. It's no longer all of me, basically. It's a part of me. So we're able to separate self or become the observer as we begin to look at this part of our personality. And once a patient manifests a critical mass of self, once the client is able to do this regularly without prompting, and basically they have a more solidified sense of self. And when an emotion arises, it's not all of the self. That person is able to say, okay, what part of my personality is reacting now? So once a patient manifests that critical mass of self, this kind of dialogue begins to take place spontaneously. They do this without prompting by a therapist. And a lot of times, other questions are asked, like, what would you say to that part of yourself if you were talking to that part of your personality? And after the client has a discussion in their minds with that part of their personality, and they begin to understand how that part of the personality developed, then a question could be, well, where do you want that part to go now? And I think one of the most important things that he wrote was that if that part is no longer needed in the present and no longer an appropriate response because it's hurting self or relationships, you could ask that part to step back, thank it for its role in protecting you, but also, and this is the neat part, if that part of the personality is needed again, it has permission to return. So I like that addition. And the last question would be, well, how do you feel now towards that part of the personality? And you know, uh, and people have different emotions that, that part of the personality might have helped them through a critical part of their life when they felt endangered, but they might also have regrets or not be happy with that part of their personality because it was more dysfunctional when they were trying to have healthy relationships. So we can talk about some of the parts of the personality. The managers are really what I see as kind of like part of our personalities that maintain control so that we can function either in our jobs or our lives, so we can make it through and become successful. And if people have highly competent or controlling managers as part of their personality, they might be very successful in business or in another part of their lives. And they may actually place too much focus on that part of their lives because they find success in it. But that detracts from other areas of their lives, like relationships. Another personality type would be a firefighter. And that's, you can imagine why it's called that. They're putting out fires, but it's really personality crises or life crises. When things seem to be falling apart, the firefighter steps up and they may call in parts of the personality that they feel might help to regain control in a situation where an individual is feeling helpless. Exiles are basically that part of ourselves that was shut down because of the trauma. And in each case, the theme of the exile seemed to be disliked by the client. That's the part of themselves they disliked because they might have felt weak or unable to step up or protect themselves or avoid whatever trauma it was. But as they begin to talk with and examine usually that inner child, and it ends up that the self wants to protect that child rather than different parts of the personality. The self, the observing self, ends up talking to that child, having empathy for that child rather than feeling worthless or critical, and sees how helpless that child actually was at that age. And then empathy and emotions are created in response to the child that is usually stuck at the stage or age the trauma occurred. And, and once the emotions are changed from basically critical to empathic, the final act is usually wanting to protect and save that child. So we're really saving ourselves or saving that part of ourselves, saving that inner child that has been repressed for so many years. The thing that they didn't really talk about a lot is that once that takes place, once we save that inner child that has been repressed, often that part of our personality has, of course, been repressed as well. And so people experience the emotions and then the actions uh, that are more childlike. I'm not saying inappropriately childlike, but it's okay to have wonder and trust and vulnerability, and it's okay to have those feelings as an adult. So I think a lot of feelings that were repressed and not experienced as an adult are then allowed to be brought forth and experienced in their lives. So, I think it's kind of interesting. The one example, the case example that they gave was uh, he was seeing a woman, but after that, the female client um, kind of went through the IFS counseling process, then her husband came to therapy. And I think the dynamic of why those two clients were together was very interesting. And from a family systems point of view, it's all Bowen and codependency. And so you can kind of see the family systems dynamic that was playing out between those two clients, the husband and the wife, and why they were staying together and how they improved not only themselves, but also their relationship. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's IFS. Any questions or comments? Anybody have any experiences with IFS? All right. So it's about 5 till 8. So let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 5 or 6 after, and we'll have our exercises.